Hi, my name is Sam James, and I'm a biologist with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Today's lesson is going to be on the salmon food chain. Let's take a look at what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with a quick review of the salmon life cycle, and then we're going to take a look at the marine food chain and go through each of the levels, starting with phytoplankton at the bottom, working our way up to zooplankton, forage fish, salmon, and all the way up to our top predators. Then we'll take a look at some of the trophic interactions between these levels and why it's so important to have a balanced food chain. So salmon begin their lives in rivers and freshwater bodies as eggs. They hatch as alevin, and as they eat up their yolk sacs, they eventually become fry. As smolts, their bodies begin to change and prepare to swim downriver to the ocean. Where most rivers meet the ocean, you will find estuaries, where you have a mix of fresh and salt water and vegetation where the young salmon can hide and forage for prey and get adjusted to their new surroundings. Once they're ready, they will migrate out to sea, some going as far as Alaska and others staying closer to home. Throughout the salmon's life cycle, there's a trade-off. There's always this compromise between being eaten and finding enough food. Their life cycle has evolved over time to make the most of both of these situations, getting enough food and avoiding predators. So here's a question for you to consider. Why do salmon spend part of their lives in the ocean and part in freshwater? Salmon migrate to sea because there's a much richer food web for them to feed in and grow. Out in the ocean is where they accumulate 95% of their body mass before returning to the rivers to spawn many years later as adults. Meanwhile, in freshwater, their areas where they spawn and reproduce typically do not have large enough predator populations to significantly reduce the number of young that can live and grow there. So there's a strategy and there's a trade-off, this balance between predators and prey. So what is a food chain? According to the Oxford Dictionary, it's a hierarchical series of organisms, each dependent on the next as a source of food. Energy is produced at the bottom of the food chain and transferred up to the next level when it is consumed by another animal. The abundance and health of an organism at each level of the food chain will determine the strength and stability of the food chain in times of stress, and also how many organisms it can support overall. Salmon sits somewhere in the middle of the food chain. They eat the smaller organisms beneath them and are eaten by larger predators above them. But first, let's start at the bottom of the food chain with phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are microscopic organisms. In fact, the dinoflagellates you can see here would not be visible to the naked eye. They're only visible under a microscope. Like plants on land, phytoplankton contain chlorophyll, and because of this, they're able to do photosynthesis. In this process, they use the sun's energy to transform carbon dioxide into organic carbons that they use to make their body parts. They're so numerous in the ocean that they perform about 50% of the photosynthesis on the planet. Oxygen is one of the important byproducts of photosynthesis, and therefore they also produce about 50% of the world's oxygen. In fact, life on Earth would not be possible without these phytoplankton. They're also the base of the largest food web in the world. They provide energy for other animals. They also need sunlight and nutrients to grow. And so you often find phytoplankton accumulate near the surface of the ocean. And after winter, as the days grow longer, there's more sunlight reaching the ocean surface, you'll see a rapid increase in the number of phytoplankton. This is known as the spring bloom. As phytoplankton increase in abundance, they'll compete with one another for nutrients. And as they compete over time, the number of phytoplankton will decrease and they will reduce in number through the fall and winter as the days once again grow shorter. This cycle repeats itself every year. So here's something to consider. If phytoplankton bloom and are most abundant in the spring, How do you think that affects the abundance of the other animals that feed on them? Have a moment to think about this. Well, perhaps you'll know the answer once we've learned a bit more about the other elements of the food chain. So next we have zooplankton, our secondary producers. Some of these zooplankton eat phytoplankton. Therefore, their abundance and the timing of zooplankton is closely linked to that of phytoplankton. So, shortly after the spring bloom, we will also see an increase in the abundance of zooplankton, and this will decrease and be lower over the fall and winter. Zooplankton are the young and juveniles of other larger invertebrates or fish. Here on the left is a video of the juvenile barnacles. Barnacles will spend part of their lives as zooplankton before settling to the sea floor and forming their hard outer shells and becoming the adult barnacles that we're all more familiar with. Jellyfish are also zooplankton, as you can see with this lion's mane jellyfish on the right. As you can see, there's a wide range in the size of zooplankton, from the microscopic to the massive, with some of the largest jellyfish reaching 8 meters in diameter. Zooplankton come in all shapes, forms, and sizes. They've adapted special body parts to help them move through the water and capture their prey. Even their coloration and their markings are designed to help them make them more visible or less visible to both predator and prey. The types of zooplankton that you'll find in the water at any given time depend on a number of different things, including the currents themselves, the amount of phytoplankton or other food available, the number of predators that there are to consume them, and things like the temperature of the water. So just like on land, in colder climates, or in this case, colder waters, you will typically find zooplankton with higher fat reserves to help them survive the colder conditions. Whereas in warmer climates or warmer waters, you'll find zooplankton with lower fat reserves, and they're typically smaller or thinner. So in this way, the environment can also determine the amount of energy available in the food chain to be transferred up from zooplankton to the next food level. Similar to cows and other grazers on land, you also have the herbivores and the carnivores when it comes to zooplankton. So in this case, krill and copepods are two of the most abundant zooplankton, and these are two herbivores. They're also two of the most abundant animals in the world. Some zooplankton eat each other, and then we also have omnivores eating both phytoplankton and zooplankton. Some carnivores have large insect-like eyes to help them hunt, while others have fierce jaws and jagged claws to help them capture and eat their prey. Jellyfish use sticky tentacles to capture their prey and draw them into their mouths. So, do you think that some plankton could be more nutritious than others? And why? You might be able to tell by comparing some of the different features of the zooplankton shown here. Next up the food chain are our forage fish. These are the small, schooling fish like Pacific sand lance or herring. Did you know that Pacific herring are one of the most numerous fish species on the coast of BC? They also play a crucial role in the marine food chain. They are that bridge between the smaller organisms at the base of the food chain and the higher levels of the food chain, the larger fish and predators. They're caught in many fisheries on the coast of BC and are really important species to many of the First Nations communities. Many forage fish spawn on sandy, intertidal beaches, which means they're also vulnerable to changes in these areas, typically due to climate change or urban development. Next up the food chain, we have our salmon. There are 5 species of Pacific salmon, and each have evolved to eat slightly different things. So for instance, sockeye, pink, and chum salmon are known as planktivores because they eat more zooplankton than, say, forage fish. Meanwhile, coho and chinook salmon are known as piscivores because they eat more fish than zooplankton. Chum are also unique in that they're known to eat more gelatinous prey or more jellyfish. The first few months at sea are an important time for juvenile salmon. They need to eat enough food and gain enough energy to grow fast and avoid predation. They tend to enter the ocean when the food is most available. So as if you remember, we have the spring bloom followed by a peak in the zooplankton abundance, and this is when salmon have evolved to enter the ocean. So some of you might be wondering, how do we know what these animals are actually eating? How do we know what salmon eat? There are many different ways that we can find this out. If you are out in the field, for instance, you could flush a salmon's stomach with water and pump out its contents, releasing the fish relatively unscathed. Or you could take the sample back to the lab, remove the stomach, and dissect its contents, sorting them into the different prey types. There's lots of different types, as you can see shown here, from the more hard-shelled crustaceous animals like copepods, amphipods, and decapods, but also more gelatinous prey, like these blobs in the lower right corner. Gelatinous prey, as you can see, can be much harder to tell in the salmon's stomach as they break down much faster than the hard-bodied zooplankton. Coming back to the food chain, we now reach our top predators. These predators eat salmon throughout their life cycle, from the juveniles all the way up to the adults. This is largely a matter of size. So the smaller predators, such as birds or other fish, will typically feed on the juvenile salmon, whereas larger predators, such as grizzlies or killer whales, will go for the adult salmon. Seals and sea lions are somewhere in between, and they'll eat salmon of all sizes. We often hear about killer whales in the news, particularly the southern resident killer whales. These animals are an endangered species, facing many threats, including threats to their food supply. Chinook salmon are the main prey for southern resident killer whales, and many of their populations are becoming at risk as well. It is uncertain what will happen to the southern residents if their food supply diminishes. So let's take a moment to look at these figures. In the top two figures, we have the mortality index of both northern resident and southern resident killer whales. So here, any bars above the line show an increase in the deaths of killer whales, while a bar below the line shows a decrease in the deaths. In the bottom figure, we have an abundance index for Chinook salmon. So what relationships can you see between these three figures? Maybe let's focus on the period between the mid-1990s and 2000. This is when you can see Chinook abundance was the lowest. This also happens to be when we see a dramatic increase in the number of killer whale deaths. So while there may be some other environmental factors that are driving these trends affecting both Chinook and killer whales, it does appear that there's a strong relationship between the number of Chinook available and the health and survival of the killer whales. So while this shows the importance of salmon upwards in the food chain to their predators, what impact do the predators actually have on the salmon? In BC, whaling was banned in 1967, and so we saw a steady increase in the number of whales on the coast after that. There was also the ban on seal hunting in the 1970s, after which point their numbers increased exponentially through the 80s and 90s. What impact do you think an increase in predators would have on salmon, or on the entire food chain for that matter? Perhaps we should recap what we've learned first to help answer that question. Let's start at the bottom. So we have our phytoplankton, our primary producers, our photosynthesizers that generate the energy at the base of the food chain. Next, we have our zooplankton, our secondary producers that consume either phytoplankton or each other and create that important first link in the food chain to transport energy upwards. Zooplankton then provide energy to other fish, such as the forage fish, sand lance, and Pacific herring. These are then important food sources for salmon, which rely on healthy populations of both zooplankton and forage fish for their survival. Salmon themselves are then eaten by a wide array of predators at the top of the food chain. So this is your salmon food chain. So now let's come back to that initial question. What would happen if you saw an increase in the number of predators over time? Well, more predators will obviously need more food, meaning that there will be fewer salmon. If we assume that the predators are focused mainly on eating the salmon, fewer salmon means there may be more forage fish. More forage fish may be grazing on more zooplankton, therefore resulting in fewer zooplankton. With fewer zooplankton, there may be more phytoplankton at the base of the food chain. This type of interaction is known as a top-down trophic interaction, or a top-down trophic cascade, where something happens to the top of the food chain that then has cascading effects on every other level. Let's take a look at another example of a trophic interaction. Now let's say that urban development has rapidly reduced the available habitat for forage fish to spawn. Those sandy intertidal beaches have been replaced with development, and there are fewer forage fish in the ecosystem. With fewer forage fish, we may see an increase in the amount of zooplankton in the water. An increase in zooplankton means they're consuming more phytoplankton, which means we'll see a decrease in the amount of phytoplankton. This is the downward effect of a reduction in forage fish. And looking upwards, fewer forage fish may mean less food available for the salmon, such as Chinook and coho, our piscivores, that rely on forage fish. However, other salmon species, the planktivores, such as sockeye, may not be as affected by a decrease in forage fish. However, overall, a decrease in salmon will lead to a decrease in the number of predators as well. This is known as a wasp-waste trophic interaction, where something that happens in the middle or waist of the food chain has cascading effects both upwards and downwards through the food chain. Let's take a look at one more example. So in this case, let's imagine that in the future, with climate change increasing the number of storms and extreme weather events, we see very stormy winters, which make it harder for phytoplankton to stay in that surface layer and get enough sunlight to photosynthesize. This might lead to a smaller spring bloom or even no spring bloom at all. And with fewer phytoplankton at the base of the food chain, we'll see fewer zooplankton. Fewer zooplankton means there's less food available for forage fish, which means there's less food available for the salmon, and ultimately less food available for the whales, seals, birds, and other predators at the top of the food chain. So this is known as a bottom-up trophic interaction, or a bottom-up trophic cascade. As you can see from these three examples, when something happens to one level of the food chain, it impacts all other levels of the food chain. And in reality, it's even more complex than this. These species are in fact part of a broader marine food web that isn't necessarily linear. Sometimes food can be transferred both vertically and horizontally across multiple trophic levels. Plus, there are so many other species out there which may be part of this food web and may have indirect or direct impacts on salmon. So in learning about the food chain, it may now be clear to you why plankton can serve as important ecosystem indicators. There's a strong relationship between the survival of young fish, such as salmon, and the timing, quantity, and quality of their prey, plankton. The plankton health, both phytoplankton and zooplankton, is determined by environmental conditions such as temperatures or nutrient concentrations, which are ultimately being driven by the climate. Thus, climate change can alter the composition of plankton, which exerts this bottom-up pressure on salmon and the rest of the food chain. Some of these trophic interactions in the food chain that we've been discussing show up in the news as well. Salmon are a critical species to people on the coast. They provide us with food, they support our fisheries, they cycle nutrients, and they're an important species for many First Nations. So if something happens to the food chain, people are quick to notice, and to look at what impact is that going to have on the salmon. And so it is all connected. There's still lots to learn about salmon, marine ecosystems, food webs and food chains. There's the many stressors such as climate change, fisheries, pollutants that are causing rapid changes to these complex systems. And it's really important that we understand how they work so that we can support resilient and healthy ecosystems into the future.